after watching episode 5 of The Rings of Power, my main takeaway was that I thought there was some strange choices made in this week's episode. Some strange choices made in regards to decisions they've made with the lore, some interesting choices they've made in regards to certain key characters, and the fact that they've given us more questions than answers to this point within the show, and we're entering into the final stretch. And while having questions going into each episode is a good thing, having some legitimately satisfying answers helps us get excited about progressing the plot. However, I do think that there were some good things in this episode. Especially, I thought that there was one line of dialogue that hit me pretty well and thought that it had some dark foreshadowing implied within it. And I'm looking forward to talking about the good and the questionable in this week's review of The Rings of Power. The first thing that I want to do is talk about what I think worked within this episode, and I actually want to say this was the first episode where I thought that the Harfoots' journey was pretty entertaining. It still revolves around the fact that we are just interested in who and what the stranger is. Now there are new characters involved who are hunting him down, known as the Mystics. They're kind of like these traveling wise men who are probably evil. And we get this nice journey through Middle-earth as we see the adventure that the Harfoots go on in their nomadic journeys. We get a little bit of a glimpse into a place called the Grey Marshes, which is a cool callback because this is definitely what's going to turn into the Dead Marshes later on down the road after events from the Second Age unfold. And it was just kind of nice to see how they journey and adventure, and I don't think it took us out of the tone of the episode. And that was the thing where I was always struggling with the Harfoots. They always seemed to have such a different tonal shift from the rest of what was going on in the show, but their journey now is getting more serious. We have them in a bit of danger as they're running away from wolves. And although I think that some of the action sequences in this show are kind of questionable, right? They aren't shot all that well and they don't come across as all that high quality in regards to the budget. They feel more like television action than cinematic action. This whole entire sequence is basically used to give us a glimpse into some of the powers that the stranger has, definitely making us think that he's a wizard. Is it Gandalf? Is it Radagast? Is it a blue wizard? We don't know. Maybe it's Sauron. Who knows? Is he good? Is he bad? This is what the show wants us to be thinking as it develops his plot, and I thought that this was the best episode that the Harfoots and the stranger were involved in. I was interested in it, I was engaged in it, and I wasn't distracted by anything that they did within the story. It was quick, snappy, and they got what they wanted to get across in an efficient way. Speaking of efficiency, I can't necessarily say that all things in Numenor are always efficient in the way that the sequence is managed down there, but I do think that there's a particular scenario within Numenor's segment that I thought was worth talking about, and that is a scene with Isildur. And to this point in my reviews, I haven't really talked about him much because he hasn't had a huge impact on the show to this point. We've been introduced to him. Most Lord of the Rings fans know exactly who Isildur is and what he is going to become, but to this point, he hasn't been a focal point of the show. But in this episode, we get a little bit of highlight on who he is. He just wants to go into the west of Numenor, and now he wants to go into Middle-earth on this adventure, and he just seems to be somewhat of a free-spirited individual who doesn't really know what he wants out of life, but he just wants something different than the status quo, but doesn't really want to go through the work in order to be able to earn that. Rather, he's depending on his father and friends to maybe help him get into the position that they need to be. However, that's not necessarily what I think was really good about this episode. There's a particular sequence where he is talking with his friend Valendil that a certain line is said that hit home pretty hard for me. So after having a bit of a fisticuffs exchange, Valendil says to Isildur this: "One day I hope you find something that you won't be willing to sacrifice anything for." Now this line hits hard because we know that Isildur eventually finds that thing. However, it's not necessarily anything good. It's the One Ring when he cuts it off of Sauron's hand and instead of casting it into Mount Doom, decides to keep it for himself. Another thing that stuck out to me in this episode as very good is that this scenario within the Southlands with Arondir, Bronwyn, Theo, all of those folks down in the Southlands continues to be the most consistently entertaining within the show. Sure, it has its clunky moments just like anything else in the show does, but it seems to have the most balance between having some type of adversary who we have tension with that seems to be well executed. The pacing seems to be pretty good. The dynamic between Arondir and Bronwyn isn't very great, but it's good enough to be passable. But I think that the hero himself, Arondir, is portrayed very well. He's probably one of the most likable characters within the show, and I just think overall this is the more interesting part of the show. I think part of it is because we know that this is turning into Mordor, and because it's all original characters, we're not constantly scrutinizing how accurate this is to Tolkien's mythology, because very little is written about the creation of Mordor. It's just kind of lines in the book of Sauron going there and creating Mordor within the Second Age, but not a whole ton of details that we can really scrutinize and say it happened this way or it didn't happen this way. So we can kind of enjoy the ride, and I think for the most part, the show's executed this sequence pretty well. Now, that gets me to the point where I want to talk about the things I think were strange decisions for this show, and the first thing I'm going to mention is how characters have decided to be portrayed and the theme that is behind two of the key characters, maybe even more, but very clearly with two of the High Elves, being Galadriel and Gil-galad, basically deciding to make them characters who we as audience members don't really like. And in this episode, we see Galadriel kind of coming to realization of that with a particular line that she says that reiterates a theme that came up in the first episode. In a conversation she's having with Halbrand, trying to convince him to come to the Southlands to aid his people and take up his crown, she says to him, "Sometimes to find the light, we must first touch the darkness." That is the storyline of Galadriel in this first season. She is in a dark place, and it got to a point where her crew mutinied her and the leaders of the kingdom exiled her, right? She's in a dark place, and she feels like in order to make it to the light, maybe she first had to experience that darkness. So essentially, if you didn't like Galadriel throughout the first few episodes, I don't think you're at fault, because I don't know if the show wants us to like her. She's supposed to be in a dark place, and they've essentially done the same thing with Gil-galad, right? This is supposed to be an honorable and noble king. He gets the kingdom of elves and men. He and Elendil, they lead them to fight Sauron at the end of the Second Age. He is a noble man who's in a very dark place right now. And honestly, the show hasn't really portrayed him in any type of positive light. I don't think he's an extremely likable character. We see that Elrond is definitely the person we side with in decisions between Elrond and Gil-galad himself seems to be in a dark place. Maybe it's because he's being manipulated by a certain someone, or maybe he's just very concerned with what is happening within the kingdom and this blight. And that leads me to my second strange choice that this show has decided to do, and that is just giving us more mysteries as the show goes on and not any more answers, right? We have the revealing of the blight, the introduction of the mystics, the question of is the stranger good or bad? What is the blade? Now it's some type of key. What does the key exactly do? There's a lot of questions that haven't gotten answers, and we only have 3 episodes left in the first season, and I'm just curious which ones are going to be answered and which ones they're going to leave up in the air. I would hope that they answer most of these, and of course, the biggest question being, who is Sauron? And I don't know if we'll get that one by the end of this season or not. But it's a very interesting way to go about telling stories in Middle-earth, and I just don't know if this is what people expected, but the payoffs are going to have to deliver in order to prove that this was worth it. And the last thing I think was a super strange choice was to make a rather large change to Tolkien's lore in the way in which they describe the origins of Mithril. The story that they tell about the elf who goes to the tree and fights off the Balrog by putting all of his light into the tree, and the Mithril is basically all of this power that was spread throughout the mountain after a strike of lightning, spread all of the light throughout these veins of ore within the Misty Mountains, is not of Tolkien, right? Like, that is not the background of Mithril. That is totally original to the show, and I think that's a bit of a strange choice. However, the question that we have is this a reliable narrative? Is this a myth within a myth, so to speak? Is this a tall tale within a fictional story that we are not supposed to believe? Maybe there is some agent of darkness who has spread this rumor about things in Moria, and it has gotten to the elves, and the elves have thought that the long-lost power of the Silmarils is contained within Mithril, but it's just a fallacy because this certain someone wants them to find and dig and seek the Balrog. I don't know. And this is a strange choice because if it is either a made-up story in order to manipulate the elves, or they're deciding that this is the origination of Mithril, I'm not sure that I like either one. They might be able to pull it off and convince me if this is some way to manipulate the elves, to manipulate the dwarves, who will then release the Balrog. Maybe that'll work in the long run, but it has me more concerned than excited about where this could go. But the show has to start answering questions, picking up the pace, and giving us more excitement and making us enjoy what's happening with the characters on screen. What were your guys' favorite parts of this episode? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more Rings of Power. My name is Cody, and I will talk to you next time on Parallel Quest. Bye-bye.